On October 27, 1973, the Marjorie Merriweather Post Foundation handed over the keys of a 128-room mansion to the federal government of the United States. The property, built between 1924 and 1927 in Palm Beach, Florida, had cost $7 million at the time, the equivalent of more than $100 million today. It contained 36,000 Spanish tiles from the 15th and 16th centuries, transported from a private collection and from a castle in Cuba. Its exterior walls were built with Dorian stone, a fossilized limestone imported in 3 shipments from Genoa, Italy. The bathrooms had gold-plated fixtures because the owner considered gold easier to clean than chrome. The main salon measured 1,800 square feet with 40-foot ceilings. 600 workers, including 300 craftsmen brought expressly from Europe, had spent 3 years completing it. The woman who had built all of that, and who was now turning it over to the state on the condition that it be used as a winter residence for the presidents of the United States, had died on September 12th of that same year. Her name was Marjorie Merriweather Post. She was, at the time of her death, the wealthiest woman in America. And what she wanted to happen with Mar-a-Lago, the vision that had guided every decision about the property for half a century, never happened the way she had planned. What did happen was Donald Trump. This is the story of the woman who built the most famous mansion in America, of what Mar-a-Lago really was, and of what it means that its final destiny is exactly what its creator had imagined, but in the hands of someone she would have found utterly improbable. To understand Marjorie Merriweather Post, you have to start where her entire story starts, in a barn in Battle Creek, Michigan, in the late 19th century, where her father, Charles William Post, was pasting labels on boxes of a coffee substitute made from roasted ground wheat that he called postum. C.W. Post was an agricultural machinery salesman with a gift for advertising and a fragile constitution that led him to the Battle Creek Sanitarium in 1891, seeking treatment for his nervous episodes. The Battle Creek Sanitarium was at that time the national center of a health movement that preached natural eating, vegetarianism, and rest as the answer to the ailments of modernization. C.W. Post didn't fully recover, but he learned something worth more than any cure: that America was willing to pay for foods that promised wellness, and that the secret of the food business was not the product, it was the marketing. Postum came to market in 1895 with an advertising campaign that accused coffee of causing illness and presented the wheat substitute as the healthy alternative. Then came grape nuts, which C.W. Post marketed with the claim that they were good for the kidneys, the appendix, and virtually any ailment a consumer might have. The medical claims were entirely unfounded, as the regulators of the era would eventually point out, but the sales were real. Before the 19th century ended, C.W. Post was a millionaire. Before the 20th century reached its 15th year, he was one of the wealthiest men in America, with a fortune estimated at $20 million. And he had one child, Marjorie. Marjorie Merriweather Post was born in Springfield, Illinois, on March 15, 1887. She was an only child, which in the context of C.W. Post meant something specific and deliberate. There was no male heir to hand the business to, so the business would go to her. C.W. Post began his daughter's business education when she was 8 years old, bringing her to the Postum factory in Battle Creek to paste labels on boxes as if she were just another employee. At 10, he took her to board meetings. He explained the decisions, asked her to observe how markets were analyzed and expansion strategies developed. He taught her to read financial statements, to understand production margins, to evaluate acquisition opportunities. When Marjorie was 16, her father enrolled her at the Mount Vernon Seminary in Washington, D.C., a private institution for elite women that was not the typical finishing school, but a place that combined academic education with training in languages, art, and music. The preparation C.W. Post wanted for his daughter was not the kind that prepared a woman to be a good wife. It was the kind that prepared her to be a good chief executive. In 1905, at 18, Marjorie married Edward Bennett Close, an investment attorney from Greenwich, Connecticut. It was the first of her 4 weddings, and the only one that resembled what early 20th century American society understood as conventional marriage for a woman of her position. They had 2 daughters, Adelaide and Eleanor, and lived with the level of comfort the close name could sustain, which was considerable, if not extraordinary. Everything changed on May 9, 1914. That day, in Santa Barbara, California, C.W. Post took his own life. He was 59 years old. He had spent months recovering from an appendix operation that had not gone well. Suffering chronic pain and a depression, his doctors didn't know how to treat. He left an estate valued at $20 million, equivalent in purchasing power to more than $500 million today, and he left the Postum Cereal Company, with its factories and its brands and its market share and its business model built on aggressive marketing of functional foods, to his 27-year-old daughter. The complication arrived in the form of a second wife. Leila Young Post, who had been C.W. Post's secretary and had married him in his later years, claimed her share of the inheritance. Marjorie's lawyers located an original document that C.W. Post had written explicitly declaring his wish to leave the company to his daughter. The litigation was settled. Out of court, Leila Young received $4 million in cash, plus the Tavern Hotel, the Post Building, the Santa Barbara House, and stakes in other properties in Texas. Marjorie kept the company. She was 27 years old. She had just lost her father in a traumatic way. She was in the middle of an inheritance dispute. She had 2 young daughters, and she had just become the sole owner of a national food company that employed thousands of people. Most observers at the time assumed she would sell or appoint a professional manager and retire to collect dividends from a mansion. Marjorie didn't either. She walked into the office. She sat down in the chair that had been her father's, and she got to work. In 1919, she divorced Close. In 1920, she married Edward F. Hutton, a Manhattan stockbroker who had the financial instincts Marjorie already possessed, but who added access to the New York capital markets she needed for what she had in mind, with Hutton as president of the company, and Marjorie as majority owner and strategic force behind all the major decisions. The Postum Cereal Company began an acquisition-driven expansion that transformed the American food industry. The logic was simple, and the execution was relentless. Marjorie had inherited a company with strong brands in cereals and coffee substitutes, but the business depended on a handful of products in a market that was diversifying rapidly. The strategy was to buy leading brands in adjacent categories and integrate them under a shared distribution and marketing structure. In 1925, they acquired Jell-O, the most popular flavored gelatin in America. In the same period, they added Maxwell House Coffee, Hellmann's Mayonnaise, Baker's Chocolate, Log Cabin Maple Syrup, Sanka, Minute Tapioca, and dozens of smaller brands. Every acquisition was analyzed, negotiated, and executed with the same discipline that C.W. Post had taught Marjorie at the Battle Creek board meetings when she was 10 years old. But the most visionary acquisition of all was the one no one else wanted to make. At some point in the mid-1920s, while sailing on her yacht, Hussar, in the waters off Gloucester, Massachusetts, Marjorie heard about a local inventor named Clarence Birdseye, who had developed a technique for flash freezing food that preserved its texture, flavor, and nutritional properties in a way that existing freezing methods could not match. Birdseye had observed how Arctic Inuit froze freshly caught fish at extreme temperatures, and had understood that the speed of the process was the key. Slow freezing formed large ice crystals that ruptured cells and degraded food quality, while flash freezing produced microscopic crystals that caused no such damage. Birdseye's company faced the same problem as every innovation that arrives before the infrastructure needed to distribute it exists. Stores had no freezers. Without freezers at the point of sale, there was no way for consumers to buy frozen food. And without a market for frozen food, no investor was going to finance the installation of freezers in thousands of stores across the country. Marjorie saw the solution where others saw the problem. The scale of the Postum Cereal Company was large enough to finance freezer installations at its own distribution points and to pressure distribution chains into adopting the technology. She bought Birdseye's company in 1929 for $22 million, a figure that scandalized the financial analysts who couldn't understand what was in that company to justify that price. What justified the price was Marjorie's vision of where the American food market was heading over the next several decades. She was right. Bird's Eye Frozen Foods became one of the corporation's most profitable businesses. That same year, 1929, the Postum Cereal Company was renamed General Foods Corporation. It was the largest food company in America, with a portfolio of brands covering virtually every category in the modern supermarket. Marjorie Merriweather Post was its majority owner and most influential director. She was also, at that moment, the wealthiest woman in the United States, with a fortune that journalists of the era estimated at $250 million, equivalent to more than $1.5 billion today. And 2 years before all of that was definitively consolidated, she had already finished building Mar-a-Lago. The decision to build a house in Palm Beach was made in 1923. Marjorie already had properties in New York, on Long Island, and in the Adirondacks, but Palm Beach was the winter destination of the American elite in the 1920s, and she wanted to be there in a way that corresponded to her position. She bought a 17-acre parcel between the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Worth for $100, a price that reflects the state of the Palm Beach real estate market before the 20s boom sent values soaring. To design the house, she hired Marion Sims Wyeth, a Palm Beach architect and interior designer Joseph Urban, who had worked for the Metropolitan Opera, for palaces in Egypt, and for Broadway productions. The collaboration produced something that architecture critics of the era described as a monumental aesthetic clash. The Hispano-Moorish exterior, with its Italian stone and 15th-century Cuban tiles. The interiors blending Renaissance details with elements from different periods and styles. The gilded coffered ceilings, the black and white marble floors, imported from a Cuban castle in 2-square-meter slabs. Palm Beach, which had its own exacting standards of good taste, found Mar-a-Lago excessive when it was completed in 1927. 600 workers had spent 3 years on it. The final cost was $7 million, more than $100 million in today's terms. The house had 114 rooms, 58 bedrooms, and 33 bathrooms. The main salon covered 800 square feet of surface with 40-foot ceilings. The fixtures were gold-plated. There was a screening room, a spa, several auxiliary buildings for staff, a 9-hole golf course, greenhouses, a citrus grove, and 3 underground bunkers that Marjorie installed in the 1950s when the Cold War turned the possibility of a nuclear attack into a threat that American citizens took seriously. Daily maintenance required 60 employees, 30 for the interior and 30 for the grounds, but Marjorie only lived at Mar-a-Lago for 6 weeks a year, from New Year's through George Washington's birthday on February 22nd. The rest of the year she was at the Burden Mansion on 5th Avenue in New York, at Topridge in the Adirondacks, at Hillwood in Washington, D.C., or sailing on the Sea Cloud, the 4-masted, 236-foot yacht that was, when it was launched in 1931, the largest private sailing vessel in the world. A vessel with Louis XVI-style decorated cabins, a pink marble bathroom, a movie theatre, a fully equipped operating room with its own medical staff. The yacht she lent to the United States Navy during the Second World War for $1 a year to serve as a patrol vessel. The life Marjorie built around her fortune was a logistical operation of a scale that is difficult to imagine even for someone who knows the numbers. In the early 1930s, at the height of her economic power, she simultaneously owned Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, the 5-story Burden Mansion on 5th Avenue in New York, a Tudor property on Long Island that would later become C.W. Post College, Camp Topridge in the Adirondacks, with 70 buildings on 300 acres, including a Russian dacha and a main lodge with full service, plus guest cabins, each with their own butler, and Hillwood in Washington, D.C. Each property required permanent staff, maintenance managers, and a logistical coordination that would have occupied a sizable executive team. Marjorie managed it all from the center, with the same organizational discipline she applied to running General Foods. The private plane she owned, the Merriweather, was described by aviation journalists of the era as the largest private aircraft in the world. The Sea Cloud, which she and Hutton launched in 1931 at 236 feet with 4 masts, was designed under her direct instructions, with staterooms furnished with gilded bronze beds, silk textiles, oriental rugs, a dining room that could accommodate 40 people for a formal dinner, and complete medical equipment, including a functioning operating room. When World War II began and the U.S. Navy needed auxiliary vessels, Marjorie lent the Sea Cloud for $1 a year, allowed them to remove the 4 masts and paint it military grey, and recovered it at the end of the war with a settlement of $175,000 for restoration. She restored it and kept sailing on it. The accounting of all that, the capital flow required to simultaneously maintain those properties, those vehicles, and those lifestyles, was possible because General Foods Corporation generated annual dividends that made Marjorie one of the highest passive income earners in America. And because Marjorie, who had learned at 8 to paste labels on Postum boxes and at 10 to analyze board reports, was remarkably austere in her personal discretionary spending for someone of her means, she invested in properties, she invested in art, she invested in philanthropy, but she didn't squander capital on passing whims. Every major expenditure had a logic behind it that any financial analyst would have recognized as sound. The 6 weeks at Mar-a-Lago were enough for the mansion to function as the center of Palm Beach social life during the season. Marjorie was the ultimate hostess. Her gala dinners followed protocols refined over decades. The selection of the china, the arrangement of the flowers, the sequence of courses, the mixing of guests to ensure every table had the right conversation. In 1929, when she hired the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus to perform at a charity fundraiser, she also invited underprivileged children from the area to attend the show. It was the same logic that presided over her entire life. Money existed to make things work better, and the best way for things to work better was to share them. Marjorie Merriweather Post's philanthropy deserves more space than it typically receives in accounts of her life, because it was not the decorative kind of philanthropy that characterized many great fortunes of her era. It was operational philanthropy, with concrete objectives, measurable outcomes, and direct oversight by the owner. During the Great Depression, the Salvation Army soup kitchen she personally financed in New York served daily meals to thousands of people for years. She donated the cost of the national headquarters of the Boy Scouts of America in Washington, D.C. She contributed $100,000 to the building that would become the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. She funded free concerts by the National Symphony Orchestra that brought classical music to audiences who would otherwise never have had access to it. The 425-acre Lake Merriweather in Virginia bears her name. So does the Merriweather Post Pavilion in Columbia, Maryland, one of the great outdoor concert venues on the East Coast. During World War II, she financed a convalescent hospital on the grounds of Mar-a-Lago for wounded soldiers. The French government awarded her the Legion of Honor for financing medical supplies sent to France during the First World War. She received the Cross of Honor from the United States Flag Association. Eleanor Roosevelt presented her a medal for chairing a judicial ethics oversight committee that functioned as an independent watchdog. That is the kind of recognition earned when philanthropy is genuine and results are verifiable. The contrast between that history of slow, deliberate construction of durable institutions and the contemporary use of Mar-a-Lago is one of those contrasts that history produces unintentionally, but with a precision that is hard to ignore. Marjorie built for decades to leave a legacy. What came after, bought in an afternoon through a real estate pressure tactic, and turned what had been bequeathed into a membership fee business. The Great Depression, which began in October 1929 with the stock market crash, did not destroy Marjorie's fortune the way it destroyed those of many other large property owners of the era. General Foods Corporation sold basic foods, and demand for basic foods does not collapse even during the worst periods of economic contraction. But Marjorie understood immediately that having money, when everyone else was losing it, created a responsibility she could not ignore. From 1929 onward, she personally financed and oversaw a Salvation Army soup kitchen in New York. She led fundraising campaigns for the State Unemployment Relief Committee. She filled Mar-a-Lago with guests who paid for their stay through donations to charitable causes. She continued living at the level of expenditure she always had, but channeling a significant portion of that expenditure into initiatives to help those who had lost everything. In 1935, after a long and contentious period, Marjorie divorced E.F. Hutton. That same year she married Joseph E. Davies, a Washington, D.C. attorney with diplomatic ambitions who was appointed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1936 as the second United States ambassador to the Soviet Union. Marjorie went to Moscow. What she found there permanently changed the nature of her art collections and left a mark that still defines the most enduring part of her legacy today, more enduring even than Mar-a-Lago. Stalin had been in power for more than a decade when Davies and Post arrived in Moscow in 1937. The Soviet regime had needed foreign currency to finance its military industrialization program since the earliest years of the revolution, and one source of that currency had been the sale on Western markets of art treasures the Bolsheviks had confiscated from the Romanov family, from the Tsarist aristocracy, and from the Russian Orthodox Church. Fabergé pieces, imperial porcelain, icons, silver cutlery, liturgical chalices, palace furniture. Everything with market value in the West had been moved from Soviet state warehouses to auction rooms and dealers in Paris, London, and New York. By the time Davies and Post arrived, the most abundant flow of those sales had slowed, but in the back rooms of commissariats and state warehouses, pieces still remained. Marjorie would recall years later finding silver chalices, blackened beyond recognition, sold by weight with no one knowing or caring about their historical value. Ecclesiastical vestments piled in unventilated rooms, uncatalogued icons, imperial porcelain stacked without protection. She bought. With the precision of someone who had learned to recognize value where others saw disorder, and with the financial resources of someone for whom price was never the deciding factor, Marjorie began building in Moscow what would become the largest collection of Russian imperial art outside Russia. The pieces traveled back to the United States with her when Davies completed his diplomatic mission in 1938. What Marjorie Post did in Moscow has generated a historical debate that the archives of Hillwood, the museum where the collection now rests, address with an honesty that does them credit. Critics of the era, and some later historians, noted that the works of art the Soviet state was selling had previously been confiscated from their rightful owners through procedures that no Western legal system would have considered valid. Marjorie and Davies, the argument goes, were the ultimate beneficiaries of an expropriation process that had begun with the revolution and continued through Stalin's purges. The counter-argument, which Marjorie herself articulated in her lifetime and which Hillwood upholds today, is that the transactions were conducted with the recognized governmental authority of the only state that existed in Russia at that moment, that neither Marjorie nor Davies was involved in the original acts of confiscation, and that the alternatives for those pieces were not restitution to their original owners or preservation in Soviet museums, but sale to anonymous buyers or destruction. Whether Marjorie Post's purchase, preservation, and eventual opening of those pieces to the American public constitutes cultural rescue or complicity in looting depends on the vantage point from which you read the history. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Hillwood Estate, Museum and Gardens, in Washington, D.C., today houses the largest collection of Russian imperial art outside Russia. Nearly 90 Fabergé pieces, 60 imperial porcelain, services, 25 liturgical silver chalices, 2 imperial Easter eggs, and the bridal crown of Empress Alexandra. A stray Fabergé egg found in the American Midwest was valued in 2015 at $33 million. The complete collection has no reference price because the museum considers it beyond valuation. What is documented is that Marjorie Post built that collection with the same acuity with which she had built General Foods, identifying value where others didn't see it, moving before the consensus arrived, and paying without hesitation when the piece was right. Marjorie's third marriage, to Joseph Davies, is also the one that has generated the most questions among historians, and not only because of the Russian art collections. Davies published in 1941 a memoir called Mission to Moscow that described Stalin's Soviet Union in a manner his critics found naively favorable to the Soviet regime, and that sparked heated debates about whether Davies had truly understood what he was seeing in Moscow, or whether his ideological sympathies had distorted his perception. The Warner Brothers film, based on the book in 1943, made during the wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, was a commercial success and a piece of dated propaganda that embarrassed many of its participants when revelations about Stalin's crimes became public in the years that followed. Marjorie appears as a character in that film, played by Anne Harding. What the archives reveal about Davies's activities in Moscow goes beyond what the diplomatic memoirs report. Subsequent historical investigations have noted that Davies and Post acquired some works of art at nominal prices that did not reflect their real value, potentially benefiting from the economic urgencies of Soviet sales in ways that would have been unthinkable in free market transactions. That some of the pieces that entered the Post collection came from Russian private collections confiscated not only from the Romanov family, but from Soviet citizens who had been victims of the Stalinist purges. The Hillwood archives approach this history with an academic transparency that the museum itself has developed in recent years. Acknowledging that the provenance of some pieces is complicated does not invalidate the collection or cancel it as cultural heritage, but it does require telling the story honestly. Marjorie never publicly expressed regret for her Moscow acquisitions. Her position, which she maintained until the end of her life, was that she had rescued from oblivion or destruction pieces that would otherwise have disappeared from the cultural heritage of humanity. That position is debatable, but it is not implausible. What is verifiable is that today those pieces are accessible to the American public in a functioning museum that preserves them to the highest standards. That would have been impossible had Marjorie not bought them, regardless of the conditions under which the sale occurred. Marjorie's fourth marriage, to Herbert A. May, a Pittsburgh businessman, lasted from 1958 to 1964. It was the briefest of her marriages, and the one that left the smallest mark on the narrative of her life. After the divorce, she reclaimed the Post name and kept it until her death. 4 marriages, all ending in divorce, in an era when divorce was socially difficult, even for people with the resources to manage it discreetly. The 4th time Marjorie filed for divorce, she was 77 years old. She had gone from being the daughter of an agricultural machinery salesman to being the wealthiest woman in America. She had run the country's largest food conglomerate at a time when women executives were still exceptional enough to generate headlines as a curiosity. She had collected Russian imperial art in Moscow under Stalin. She had lent her yacht to the Navy during the war. She had built and donated museums and hospitals and concert halls. And at 77, she was still together enough to walk away from a marriage that wasn't working. But let's return to Mar-a-Lago, because the story of Mar-a-Lago after Marjorie's death is the one that connects everything else to what the name means in the world today. Marjorie had made the decision long before she died. The property she had built to be the finest winter residence in America should also serve as the winter residence for the presidents of America. It was the final expression of a philanthropic impulse that ran through her entire life. Build great things and then put them in service of something greater than yourself. So in her will, she left Mar-a-Lago to the federal government on one condition, that it be used as a winter White House, as a meeting point between the president and his foreign counterparts, in a setting that reflected the greatness of the American nation. She also left a maintenance fund of $259,512 annually, which in 1973 seemed sufficient. It wasn't. Richard Nixon's administration already had its own winter White House, Key Biscayne in Miami. Nixon never used Mar-a-Lago, neither did Gerald Ford. Jimmy Carter, who came to power in 1977 with an austerity program that didn't sit well with the concept of staying in a 114-room mansion with gold-plated fixtures, formally returned it to the Post Foundation in 1981, citing the maintenance costs, which by then exceeded $1 million a year, just for basic upkeep, not counting the security personnel any presidential residence would have required. The Post Foundation put it on the market at $25 million. And there began one of the most documented and most revealing real estate negotiation episodes in the history of the American industry. Donald Trump had been in Palm Beach. He had tried to buy several apartments for his family and hadn't found what he was looking for. When Mar-a-Lago came to market, he saw it. According to his own account in The Art of the Deal, his first offer was $15 million, 25% below the asking price. The foundation rejected it. Other potential sales fell through for various reasons: the maintenance cost, the historic restrictions that National Historic Landmark status imposed on any modification, the sheer logistical scale of managing a property of that size. Then Trump did something the Post Foundation hadn't anticipated. He bought, for $2 million, the beach parcel between Mar-a-Lago and the Atlantic Ocean, which belonged to a seller named Jack C. Massey, and he announced that he was going to build on that parcel a structure that would completely block the ocean views from Mar-a-Lago. Trump described it years later with his characteristic syntax of self-congratulation. "That was my first wall. That drove everyone crazy. They couldn't sell the big mansion because I owned the beach, so the price kept going down and down." He was accurate about the mechanism, though the precise details vary across his different retellings. The threat worked exactly as designed. The value of Mar-a-Lago without Atlantic views was substantially lower than the value of Mar-a-Lago with them. Other potential buyers lost interest. The Post Foundation, operated by Marjorie's daughters, among them Dinah Merrill, the actress born Nadinia Hutton from Marjorie's marriage to E.F. Hutton, watched its negotiating position weaken with every month that passed without a viable alternative buyer. In December 1985, Trump bought Mar-a-Lago for $5 million for the property and $3 million additional for the furnishings and fixtures Marjorie had left in the house. $8 million total, though some sources cite slightly different figures depending on which components they include in the calculation. The property that had cost $7 million to build in the 1920s, equivalent to more than $100 million today, was purchased at a price no professional appraiser in Palm Beach considered a fair transaction for the selling party. Dinah Merrill told a Vanity Fair journalist what she thought of Trump after the purchase. Trump had written about her in one of his books that she was arrogant and aloof, that she had inherited her mother's looks but not her intelligence. Merrill's response to the journalist: "How charming. He's a very charming man, isn't he?" The story of how Trump bought Mar-a-Lago is the one he has told most often and embellished most heavily with each new version. The verified facts are as follows. The Post Foundation put the property on sale in 1981 at $25 million, after recovering it from the federal government. Between 1981 and 1985, 3 potential sales collapsed before closing. Trump submitted the first documented offer in 1982, $15 million, which was rejected. He then bought for $2 million the beach parcel between Mar-a-Lago and the ocean from Jack C. Massey. He announced he would build something on that parcel that would block the ocean views. The market value of Mar-a-Lago without Atlantic views was substantially lower than the value with them, and that reduction in value eliminated the interest of other potential buyers. In December 1985, Trump bought the mansion for $5 million and the furnishings and fixtures for $3 million more. Trump's own account of his negotiations has varied by book and interview. In The Art of the Deal, he states the first offer was $15 million. On other occasions, he has cited $25 or $28 million as his opening bid. The version, best documented by independent sources, including the Palm Beach Daily News and the New York Times of the era, is that the closing price was $8 million total, against the original asking price of $25. Mar-a-Lago's bargain price tag rocks community, headlined the Palm Beach Daily News in January 1986. What Trump did with Mar-a-Lago in the first years of ownership also deserves attention. He restored it. The decay it had suffered during the years of uncertainty, after the return to the government, the failed sales, and the period of reduced maintenance, had left the property in a state that required real investment. Trump invested. He hired craftsmen to restore the historic elements that had deteriorated. He added a Louis XIV-style ballroom with 40-foot ceilings and gold leaf walls at a cost the Washington Post estimated at $7 million additional dollars. He installed 5 clay tennis courts. He restored the pools. The result, debatable in aesthetic terms for those who prefer austerity to Baroque excess, was functional. A property that in 1981 was an unmaintainable white elephant became an operation that in 2016 generated nearly $30 million in declared annual revenues. Trump used Mar-a-Lago as a private residence in the early years. Then came the financial difficulties of the early 1990s, when several of his projects, including the Taj Mahal in Atlantic City, generated losses that pushed his debt empire to the edge of collapse. In 1993, he proposed to the Palm Beach Town Council, subdividing the 17-acre property into individual mansion lots. The council refused. Historic restrictions and Palm Beach zoning ordinances didn't allow it. The negotiations with the town council ended in 1993 with an agreement that transformed the maintenance problem into a business model. Mar-a-Lago would open as a private club with an entry fee. Club revenues would finance the upkeep of the historic property. Trump would retain a 2,000-square-meter apartment for personal use. The club officially opened in 1995 with an initiation fee of $200,000, annual dues of $14,000, and room rates of up to $2,000 per night. The model was an immediate financial success. Palm Beach was a market with sufficient liquidity to absorb those fees without difficulty. The roster of celebrities who performed or attended events in the years that followed included Celine Dion, Elton John, Michael Bolton, Billy Joel, and Diana Ross. It also included financier Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, as documented by photographs from the era, and as has been cited in multiple verified journalistic sources. In his legal disputes with Palm Beach County, Trump declared revenues of nearly $30 million from Mar-a-Lago for the year 2016 alone. The property that Marjorie Merriweather Post had left to the American government to be the winter residence of its presidents had become the winter residence of an American president, just not in the way she had imagined. It wasn't the president who was the state's guest in the house. It was the owner of the house who was the president. There is a detail about the construction of Mar-a-Lago that the architects and art historians who have studied the property mention repeatedly as the most revealing about Marjorie's character. It was not the largest mansion she could have built on that parcel. It wasn't remotely the limit of what her budget allowed. The specific layout she chose, the main block flanked by lower wings and separate auxiliary buildings, was designed so that the house wouldn't appear too large from the street, so that the entertainment zones, the family areas, and the service quarters would be separated in a way that made daily life more functional for everyone living in it. Marion Sims Wyeth, the architect, worked with Marjorie for months on the plans before construction began. The result was a property that impresses from the outside by its scale, but that functions from the inside as a house inhabited by people, not a monument built to intimidate. The interior photographs from Marjorie's era show spaces filled with fresh flowers, art objects arranged to be seen up close, and tables set for actual dinners with actual guests. Yusi City was not a museum before it became a museum. It was a home at the grandest conceivable scale, but a home. What Trump added when he converted Mar-a-Lago into a private club includes the Louis XIV-style ballroom with gold leaf walls and 40-foot ceilings that several architecture critics have described as the most striking example of what the American real estate vocabulary calls bling, luxury that announces itself rather than demonstrating itself. Trump himself has described that addition as the most important he made to the property. Marjorie Post would have had a different opinion, but Marjorie Post had died in 1973 and was not available to express it. When Trump announced in January 2017, days before his first inauguration, that he was writing his inaugural address at Mar-a-Lago, he posted a photo on Twitter of himself, seated at a desk with paper and pen. The caption said he was doing it at the Winter White House. The Kennedy family had wintered for decades at a family property at the northern end of Palm Beach, and John F. Kennedy had written his own inaugural address in that setting. The symmetry was real, and Trump knew it. What Trump probably didn't know, or didn't mention, is that Marjorie Post had designed Mar-a-Lago with exactly that destiny in mind. To be the stage on which the American presidency displayed itself in its greatest splendor before world leaders. During Trump's first term, from 2017 to 2021, Mar-a-Lago served as the venue for some of the most significant bilateral meetings of his presidency. Xi Jinping was there in April 2017 at the first meeting between Trump and the Chinese president, when North Korea launched a ballistic missile, and images of the American president being briefed on the club terrace, while members dined 5 meters away, generated a debate about information security that lasted weeks. Shinzo Abe was there on multiple occasions, the model Marjorie had imagined, Mar-a-Lago as the stage of American diplomacy, in a setting that reflected the country's greatness, was being executed. Though with one fundamental difference, the cost of that stage was not being paid by American taxpayers, but by the club members and paying guests who shared the facility with the sitting president. In August 2022, the FBI executed a search warrant at Mar-a-Lago in connection with the alleged retention of classified documents that Trump was said to have taken from the White House at the end of his first term. Agents removed more than 30 boxes of material. In June 2023, Trump was formally charged with 37 counts related to the unlawful retention and handling of classified documents. In November 2024, after winning the 2024 presidential election, the charges were dropped. The images of the FBI searching the most famous property in Palm Beach circulated around the world at a speed that Marjorie Post, who died 4 years before the internet existed, could never have imagined. Mar-a-Lago, designated a National Historic Landmark in 1980, valued by Trump at various points at up to $1.5 billion in his financial documents before a New York judge determined that figure to be a significant exaggeration, bought in 1985 for $8 million when it cost more than 100 times that to build, is today valued by Palm Beach County property appraisers at figures ranging between $40 and $200 million, depending on the methodology used. It remains the most famous, most discussed, and most symbolically valuable property in all of Florida. And it remains the building that Marjorie Merriweather Post constructed between 1924 and 1927, with Italian stone and Cuban tiles and European craftsmen, and the fortune her father left her, and the intelligence she herself developed over decades of real work, running the largest business any American woman of her generation had ever led. There is something that the story of Marjorie Merriweather Post and the story of Mar-a-Lago illuminate when placed together. Marjorie understood money in a way that very few people of her era understood it. Not as an end, but as an instrument, as the means to build things that outlasted whoever built them. General Foods Corporation, which she transformed from a cereal company into the largest food conglomerate in America, was acquired by Philip Morris in 1985 for $5.5 billion, 12 years after her death. The university campus on Long Island that bears her father's name, the C.W. Post campus, is still operating. The Hillwood Museum receives tens of thousands of visitors a year who contemplate a collection of Russian imperial art that without Marjorie's intervention in Moscow in 1937 and 1938 would be scattered or destroyed. The Merriweather Post Pavilion in Columbia, Maryland, is still one of the great outdoor concert venues on the East Coast, and Mar-a-Lago still exists, with its 15th century tiles and its Genoese stone and its Cuban marble floors, because Marjorie built it to last and built it well. The fact that what lasts is administered by someone who paid $8 million for something that cost 100 times that to build, through a pressure tactic that Trump himself described as his first wall, is an irony that Marjorie's biographers have noted with varying degrees of discomfort. But it is also, from another angle, the confirmation of its creator's final wish. Marjorie wanted Mar-a-Lago to be the winter White House. She wanted American presidents to receive world leaders there, in a setting that reflected the greatness and power of the United States. She wanted the most extraordinary property in Palm Beach to be the stage for the most important American history. That is exactly what it is. It's just that Marjorie never wrote into her will that the president also had to be the owner. There is a detail about the social context of Palm Beach in Marjorie's era that connects directly to what Trump did when he converted the property into a private club, and that deserves mention because it sheds light on the difference between the two visions of the property. Palm Beach, in the 1920s and 1930s, was one of the most racially and socially segregated enclaves in America. The country clubs and hotels of the city systematically excluded Jews, Black Americans, and other minority groups, with the same quiet formality with which they excluded casual attire at gala dinners. Marjorie Merriweather Post was a daughter of the white American Protestant elite, but she never articulated those exclusions as anything positive. Her charity parties had a breadth of guests that Palm Beach social norms found irregular. When Trump transformed Mar-a-Lago into a private club in 1993 and 1995, one of his most deliberate decisions was to open membership to people that Palm Beach clubs habitually excluded: Jews, Black Americans, people of other ethnic backgrounds. He said it explicitly in several interviews of the era, framing it as a conscious break with Palm Beach exclusivism. His attorney, Michael Cohen, summarized it in a Time interview. Mar-a-Lago is a place of inclusion in a place of exclusion. That decision, whatever its actual motivations, had the effect of creating a club with a demographic diversity that Palm Beach's more traditional establishments did not have. That the $200,000 initiation fee ensured that the diversity was exclusively among people with that level of liquidity available is the irony the model contains, and one that no one has resolved. The jewels that Marjorie donated to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., at the end of her life, are another chapter of her story that deserves more space than it typically receives. Among the donated pieces was the 275-carat diamond necklace that Napoleon gave his wife, Empress Marie-Louise, along with a diamond and turquoise tiara that belonged to the same empress. There were the pear-shaped diamond earrings of 15 and 20 carats respectively that had belonged to Marie Antoinette, a ring of emeralds and diamonds that had belonged to Emperor Maximilian of Mexico, the Blue Heart diamond, a heart-shaped blue diamond of 30.82 carats, an Art Deco diamond and emerald necklace in the Mughal style. Those pieces are today in the Harry Winston Gallery of the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian, where they are accessible to the millions of visitors who pass through the museum each year. They are there because Marjorie Post donated them. The market value of that collection has no equivalent at any public auction because the pieces will not be on the market. They are permanent public heritage. That is the difference between a legacy built with the intention of lasting and one acquired with the intention of yielding a return. The question that the story of Marjorie Merriweather Post and Mar-a-Lago leaves open is not the one the headlines of recent years have posed. It is not whether Trump handled classified documents appropriately or whether Mar-a-Lago should be used for national security meetings. Those are legal and political questions that the courts and voters have been answering by their own criteria. The question that the long history leaves open is different. Marjorie Merriweather Post inherited a $20 million company at 27 years old in 1914, in an era when women could not vote in the United States, and when the idea of a woman running a national corporation was unusual enough to generate headlines. She built that company into the largest food conglomerate in the country. She bought Birds Eye frozen foods when everyone said it was madness. She went to Moscow and brought back treasures that are today public heritage in a functioning museum. She built Mar-a-Lago with the stated intention that it serve the nation. That legacy, that collection of decisions and constructions and donations, is documented in archives, in museums, in universities, in institutions that bear her name. But the name that appears in the headlines is the name of the property, not the name of whoever built it. And the person who inhabits it is someone who bought it for $8 million when it cost 100 times that to build, using a tactic he himself described as if it were a personal tactical victory. That says something about how public memory works with respect to people who build versus people who buy. Marjorie Merriweather Post was one of the most important business figures of 20th century America. Her contribution to the food industry, to the arts, to cultural diplomacy, and to public institutions is verifiable, quantifiable, and still present. But most people who hear the name Mar-a-Lago don't know who built Mar-a-Lago. They know who bought it. Marjorie Merriweather Post died on September 12, 1973, at Hillwood in Washington, D.C., after a long illness. She was 86 years old. She was buried in the garden at Hillwood, on the grounds she had turned into a museum, on the condition that her collection remain accessible to the public. The obituary Time magazine published that week began. Marjorie Merriweather Post lived as queens used to live, and now rarely can afford to. The assessment was accurate in its description, but incomplete in its diagnosis. Marjorie didn't just live at the scale of a queen. She ran a corporation the way a king would have run it. She collected art the way a state patron would have. She donated institutions the way a government would have. The distinction between what she was, a private businesswoman without any public office, and the scale of her impact on American cultural and economic life is one of the hardest things to calibrate in her story, because the available categories don't fit well what she was. When the Post Foundation handed over the keys of Mar-a-Lago to the government in 1973, with the will that turned the property into a potential winter White House, several of those present at the time recalled afterward that the feeling in the room was of a grandeur that no longer fit the times. Nixon had Key Biscayne. The federal government had other priorities. Mar-a-Lago was too large, too costly, too strange to be useful in the post-Watergate world where presidential frugality was a political virtue. That the property ends up being the residence and headquarters of the best-known American president of recent decades is not the story Marjorie would have chosen for her most visible legacy. But neither is it a story she could have foreseen, because foreseeing it would have required imagining that the categories of the political, the private, and the commercial would mix in the proportions that 21st century America has produced. That the president would receive foreign counterparts, not at the White House, but at his private club. That club members would have access to the president while he was carrying out his duties. That the value of the presidential name and the value of the membership club would reinforce each other in a model that no pre-existing regulation had anticipated. The final irony, the one that historians of the coming century will write about with more room for perspective, is that Mar-a-Lago today is exactly what Marjorie wanted it to be, the stage on which the most visible American politics plays out, the winter White House, the place where presidents receive world leaders. Only the financial model sustaining it is not the one she designed, and the name controlling it is not the one she left behind. There is one last thing worth mentioning about Marjorie's 4 marriages. Each of her husbands was chosen with a logic that her biographers have analyzed in different ways. Close was the first husband, the conventional family attorney appropriate to her social standing in 1905. Hutton was the stockbroker who brought access to the New York capital markets that Postum's expansion required. Davies was the diplomat who took her to Moscow and gave her access to the Russian imperial collections. May was the Pittsburgh businessman with whom she shared her final years of marriage before definitively reclaiming the Post name. 4 husbands, 4 distinct roles in the life of a woman who needed them for specific things and let them go when those things were no longer needed or when the marriage no longer worked. It is a cold description of relationships that presumably also had more complex emotional dimensions. But it's also accurate in a way that very few biographies of women of her era managed to be. Marjorie chose her husbands by criteria that included but were not limited to romantic love, just as a chief executive chooses partners by criteria that include but are not limited to personal chemistry. None of the 4 ever had more power over Marjorie's assets or fundamental decisions than she chose to give them. E.F. Hutton was president of the Postum Cereal Company, but Marjorie was the majority owner. The corporation was hers. The properties were hers. The funds were hers. What she built herself. If this story has stayed with you, if at any point you found yourself thinking about what it means to build something with the intention that it serve the common good, only to watch it become an instrument of something entirely different, or simply about who Marjorie Merriweather Post actually was, beyond the name that appears in the headlines about Trump, leave your thoughts in the comments. This story has more layers than fit in a single video. And if you want to know more about the great American fortunes of the 20th century and the women who built them without being remembered nearly as much as the men who inherited them or bought them, this channel has the story of Babe Paley, of Joan Kennedy, of the Ford sisters. Real power and visible power are not always the same thing. Subscribe. The next story is already on its way.